19th century, a new technology of water-powered cotton mills transformed the production of cloth, ushering in the Industrial Revolution. In Lowell, Massachusetts, the cotton mills replaced individual weavers with factories powered by water from the Merrimack River through man-made canals beginning in the 1820s. Their efficiency and the vast output of cloth was dependent on a steady supply of cotton from southern plantations. Lowell's history and its very existence as a center for the production of cloth was inextricably linked to the enslavement of African people as property to work the fields. But Lowell was also known for being a center for anti-slavery activity, abolitionist societies, and freedom seekers. Herein lies the contradiction. To explore Lowell's role in pre-Civil War America, I met with Robert Forrant, professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, who led me on a tour of the city's historic sites.
Oftentimes when I'm talking to my own students or my neighbors or whatever, people don't really fully appreciate how much of a contradiction existed in Lowell before the American Civil War, before the war that ultimately ends the institution of slavery, because the Lowell economy is so connected to cotton. 80%, so if you think about this for a second, 80% of all the business expenditures from all the cotton mills in Lowell goes to the purchase of cotton. And all of that cotton is basically the product of the labor of enslaved people. So no cotton, no Lowell, no enslaved people, no cotton, no Lowell. And these things are inextricable.
In 1834, there were 22 textile mills in Lowell. The mill workforce was made up of 5,051 women and 1,512 men. They produced 750,270 yards of cloth per week. By 1858, the number of textile mills grew to 52. Twice as many women worked in the mills as men, and 2.3 million yards of cloth were turned out.
The building that we're sitting in is built in the 1840s, and it's built to be the home of mill overseers for the Merrimack Cotton Mill and the Boot Cotton Mill that are just within a stone's throw of where we're sitting and talking. And the first occupant of the house probably walked in this very space was Linus Child, who came to Lowell in the mid-1840s to be the overseer of the boot mill.
Yale graduate Linus Child practiced law and was a Massachusetts state senator before coming to Lowell to work at the Boot Cotton Mill as an agent and mill overseer. He was also an ally to freedom seekers and white anti-slavery activists.
Again, this contradiction, right? Here he is the overseer of the mill, but he's defiantly anti-slavery. And he's involved in one of the more significant legal cases of the period of the 1840s, the arrest, the jailing, and the guilty finding against Charles Turner Torrey, who was a minister in Salem, who leaves the ministry and goes south to become an activist supporting people on the Underground Railroad. And Torrey is arrested in Maryland, put on trial, and he's linked in the trial to the successful escape of about 400 fugitives. And so he's put on trial. Child in Lowell becomes the head of the Charles Territory Defense Committee to advocate for trying to get him released from jail.
He's against slavery, but his work is so tied to slavery. So what does that look like for him?
In everything that I've read about him, and certainly I haven't read everything, I haven't yet found anything where he's agonizing over this contradiction. He somehow can compartmentalize in a way. It is interesting that while he is pushing and advocating for young women working in the mills to manifest their anti-slavery politics, if those same women organize around better wages and working conditions, he'll fire them. And so he's a person of several contradictions. And Child also plays a leading role in helping fugitives who do end up in Lowell establish businesses and live in safety in the city.
Nathaniel Booth, an enslaved man who escaped from the South, arrived in Lowell and opened a barbershop on Dutton Street. He joined a community of free and escaped Black people who made Lowell their home. Not long after Linus Child became a mill overseer, the federal government passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The act required that escaped slaves or freedom seekers be returned to their owners and that the federal government would be responsible for finding and returning them.
When the fugitive slave law is passed, the folks who were here, who were Black, who were some of them escaping slavery, they went to Canada. And Linus Child was one of the folks who really rallied and made sure, not over my dead body, right? Not here, not in Lowell. We're not going to have that. We want our folks back here, and you're allowed to have your businesses here. There were man stealers here in Lowell, and again, Lowellians said no.
And then the slave catchers show up, and the headline, "Man Stealers in Lowell."
He is now in Montreal, and his friends yesterday telegraphed to him that he had better remain there for the present. We hope, however, that he will return to the city, for we think
Linus Child was able to negotiate Nathaniel Booth's price, right? The price of his body, his human body, down to a reasonable $750. And he rallied the community to raise that money to make him a free man here in Lowell. And he was able to become a free man. He was a freedom seeker who got his freedom and was able to resume his business. And he became politically engaged and an activist, and obviously very involved in anti-slavery efforts.
The fugitive slave law makes it a federal crime to knowingly harbor a fugitive or know that there's a fugitive somewhere in your neighborhood if you don't turn them in. Because it's basically challenging people. You can't ignore it anymore. Okay, so what do you want? It's in your face now. What do you want to do? You know your barber over on Dutton is a fugitive who escaped from Maryland or Virginia or wherever, or your barber on Merrimack Street or Central Street, or the person that's at the carpenter building your back porch or whatever it might be. You know their story. They're not hiding in the sense of not letting people know what they're about and who they are. So now you have to decide, do I want to turn this person in or don't I? And again, this is really powerful in the sense that leads to so many more people in Lowell saying, yeah, okay, no, not on my watch. And historians have this phrase, the lords of the loom, the lords of the lash, right? That you've got this intermixture of wealthy white folks in the north, the lords of the loom, and slaveholders in the south, having this bond between them. And yet here's Lowell percolating along in the midst of all that, sort of carving out this other more interesting labor, working class, feminist, whatever you want to call it. There's all these things going on at once. And the room that we're speaking in would have been a place, again, to think about, right? Gives me chills sometimes to think about. Lincoln stayed here in this house when he was in Congress and then walked up to Merrimack Street and gave a talk. Very likely William Lloyd Garrison would have been here on several occasions, one of the staunchest white people in America in support of abolition, born in Newburyport, the editor of the Liberator, one of the most sort of immediate abolitionists, in-your-face. Garrison was hated in the South. He had a price on his head if he could have been caught anywhere. Frederick Douglass could have been here for meetings. There were several fugitives that were in Lowell that Child knew on a routine basis, and so any number of those folks could have been walking around in the space that we're in. So that's pretty amazing history.
Now that I know what happened here, when I walk around downtown Lowell, I feel like I've gone back to the time when momentous decisions were made that changed the history of our country. The early labor force of the textile mills were young women recruited from throughout New England. If they didn't have family accommodations locally, they were required to live in company-provided boarding houses. Their lives were strictly regulated by the company time clock, and any misbehavior on the girls' part could be reported to the mill overseers.
This would have been a boarding house that would have been connected to the boot cotton mill. All the young women that would have been living in here would have basically walked just a few hundred paces and been to work in the boot cotton mill. When I talk about the boarding houses in the history classes that I teach, I talk about them as, I refer to them as breeding grounds of discontent. Because you imagine around a table like the one that we're standing beside, people are eating and they're doing what people normally do. If you think about your own experience around a dinner table or when you meet with friends, eventually you begin to complain about something. It's just inherent in who we are and what we do.
But Rebecca, the purpose of the lecture was to inspire thought, not to give answers.
And there was no thought to his argument. I could make a better argument against slavery right now without any preparation at all.
And if you've just walked a few hundred paces from the mill building and you've been hot and anxious and machinery has been pounding in your ear, then you come back here to eat, you're probably talking about work. You might be talking about a supervisor you don't like, a foreman who's getting a little too familiar with his hands, and thinking about issues related to their wages, their working conditions, and also the question of abolitionism and of slavery. Just the kind of stuff that we can imagine would have gone on during that period of time in the 1830s, 1840s, when the mills are flourishing. It is ironic that where you have several overseers, ministers, and others in the city who are advocates of anti-slavery, they're not necessarily advocates of workers' rights. And that particularly affects young women living in the boarding houses and working in the boot mill or the Merrimack mill or the Suffolk mill or wherever one of the dozen or so scattered large mills around. But young women, hundreds and hundreds of them, are signing petitions all the time opposed to the extension of slavery.
Before the U.S. incorporated Texas into the Union as a slave state in 1845, there was a great national debate between northern and southern political forces over whether it should be a slave or a free state.
And there's a petition circulated in Lowell, and over 1,000 women signed that petition against the extension of slavery into the state of Texas, which is very important. And then there's also a similar petition that gets circulated in Lowell. In all of Massachusetts, Lowell is one of the cities with the most signatures on that petition to end the slave trade in the District of Columbia. And the lion's share of the signatures on that petition from Lowell are from young women working in the mills. So it could well be that around this table, if we could see the ghosts, several of the people sitting at this table might have actually signed that particular petition or the Texas petition.
Many of the young female mill workers came to Lowell seeking economic independence and freedom from the daily toil of farm life.
And this month I earned a few dollars more since I now work in 4 looms instead of 2.
Olive, you think it's an improvement that you work twice as hard and are paid only a fraction more?
Many would become actively engaged in the political process before they could even vote.
Young women can't vote. The suffrage amendment is a long way away from 1840 to 1920, so we've got a ways to go yet before that's going to happen in a large way. But young women get back at Kirk Boot during one of these election cycles where Boot is adamant about them not getting a shorter workday and goes and testifies in Boston to the legislature that women in Lowell basically working in the mills have got it made, and he doesn't understand. I'm paraphrasing, but in effect he's saying we don't understand why they're so upset.
We must discuss our lot so we can work together to improve it. The corporation takes advantage of us. We work morning till night, the machine's going faster all the time, and we're paid no more for it.
And they actually find a male candidate that they'll support and get other men in the city to vote for this candidate, a worker, and Boot is defeated for his legislative seat by a mill worker who young women organize for. They can't vote, but they organize and get the vote out for this particular candidate to really spite Kirk Boot, which is, I find, really cool.
A lot of these women, not only did they organize, but they were also involved in the Female Anti-Slavery Society. People like Sarah Bagley, who she wrote for the Voice of Industry at the time. And we had a lot of anti-slavery things happening in publications and things like that.
One of the arguments that the mill overseers made to get moms and dads to let their young daughters come to Lowell was that if they came to Lowell to work in the mills, there would be all this activity for them, book groups and lectures and speakers and what have you. And as the abolitionist movement grew in the city, one of those speakers was Frederick Douglass, right? Which I don't necessarily think mom and dad thought, okay, well, then my daughter's going to get to hear Frederick Douglass, right? I don't think anybody would have known early on. So you also get speakers like that, like William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of the Liberator newspaper, Douglass, several fugitives on the run from the South come through Lowell, and they're speakers somewhere downtown, either Mechanics Hall or Huntington Hall, or one of the other venues that is used for events like this all the time. So young women are going and hearing those speakers. Ministers' wives are as well involved in that, Female Anti-Slavery Society. They do a massive amount of fundraising for the Underground Railroad. They have lots of bazaars. Usually just before the Christmas holidays, they would have a big sale. And they would advertise in the newspaper, you can see the ads, that the proceeds are going to go to support the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society or whatever it would be. And then those funds would be used to support people coming along up north on the Underground Railroad.
The slave who is made in the image of the God, who made of one blood all the nations of the earth, is denied the rights the name of human beings, are bought and sold like cattle.
Where you see young women talking about their views on slavery is in the Voice of Industry, the newspaper edited by Sarah Bagley, a former mill worker who gets blacklisted, fired for organizing workers in the mills. And then she goes on her way and becomes this very influential newspaper editor in Lowell with the Voice of Industry. And there's all sorts of letters to the editor and poems that young women write, anti-slavery poetry.
Remember, too, that wrong is here, and give the North one pitying tear. Oh, let the fruits of love go forth to free the South and bless the North.
So that's how we know, that's one of the sources of information we know that women were as active as they were, because whatever made it into the Voice of Industry is like the tip of the iceberg. John Greenleaf Whittier the poet, who some of us have studied in school or whatever, for a time is in Lowell as well, editing another abolitionist newspaper from Lowell called the Middlesex Standard. In that you see the advertisements from Lowell of the businesses that are advertising in an obvious anti-slavery newspaper. You see letters to the editor. There's the Voice of Industry that Bagley's editing, and the Middlesex Standard that Whittier is editing. They're in the same building. A lot of women in Lowell would travel to female suffrage conventions and be engaged. As much as they were involved in the anti-slavery stuff, a goodly number of them were involved in advocating to get women the right to vote, because there was a big suffrage movement before the Civil War as well. And Frederick Douglass is a really interesting character in all of this, because Douglass supports women's right to vote. Usually at a big convention, they'll try to isolate African Americans, and put them in the balcony. Well, a lot of anti-slavery conventions, they want to separate the men and the women. And Douglass says, well, I'm sitting upstairs then with the women. And so again, this like so fascinating to try to understand how all these issues link, and Lowell in that way, with so much reliance on cotton, the sweatshop-like working conditions, 12-hour days, 5 days a week, and then a half a day on Saturday. And with all of that, then you still have a really broad section, goodly number of young women who can step outside that and advocate for and see the importance of these other issues, anti-slavery being one of them.
In the 1820s, the elite of the working class were the people who built the machinery that was used in the mills.
To train the next generation, they need a place to hold meetings, hold events, create a library on all sorts of things related to engineering and machinery building. And so in the early 1830s, they build Mechanics Hall. In a way, they're the elite of the working class in the city. They're paid well. They have fairly stable jobs.
And they lease out the space to fugitives.
They lease out the space on the ground floor, so we know from city directories and other records that it's fugitives that are operating these small businesses on the ground floor, a fruit stand, kind of a store market, and a barbershop. And both of these places become known environments where other freedom seekers might end up as they're passing their way through Lowell. As the country's more and more divided over this question of expansion of slavery into new territories, whether new states coming in should be free or slave, and the people operating this building know, right, who the folks are that are operating these businesses in the store. And openly as well, in the stores, they're selling Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star. They're selling William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. The barbershops are places where, almost like barbershops in the 20th and 21st century, are places where people talk politics and talk public events and get each other riled up about something, right? And so the barbershops are performing a very similar function in Lowell during this period of time. But when the law goes into effect, most of those folks, some newspaper accounts indicate as many as 150 to 175 people leave.
That building must have been empty.
Well, what happens is some of them go to New Hampshire and then to Canada. Other people go directly to Canada.
The Free Soil Party, a precursor to the Republican Party, was adamantly opposed to slavery. Its Lowell members actively fought against the fugitive slave law.
The leaders of the Free Soil Party have this huge citywide meeting, pledge their fraternity with the fugitives, and say, if you come back, we'll stand in the church door for sanctuary. We will protect you. We will make sure slave catchers do not come into the city and grab you up. And most everybody comes back. Slave catchers show up, and nobody's ever taken.
move our tour to the corner of Merrimack and Shattuck Streets to Lowell's original city hall. The ground floor was filled with storefronts, and the upper floors held offices and meeting rooms. From the mid-1830s, the upstairs meeting space was a hotbed of anti-slavery and abolition activity. Frederick Douglass spoke here on several occasions and sometimes brought with him freedom seekers who, like himself, had fled enslavement in the South.
And one of the more famous sort of kerfluffles up in there was when George Thompson, who was an abolitionist from England, comes on a tour of the United States. And in the tour, he comes to Lowell and speaks in Lowell on 3 different occasions. Thompson spoke in October of 1834 to a packed house. And this really upset Kirk Boot and a lot of the mill owners, mill investors in the city. They were fearful that if word got out that Lowell seemed to be in some way in league with anti-slavery, with abolitionism, that perhaps Southern cotton growers, plantation owners, owners of people, would boycott Lowell in terms of selling them their cotton. And so Boot and others were really fearful.
And while he was here, there was some violence that happened. A rock got thrown in a window that just nearly missed him, but he kept that rock. Why did he keep it?
He saw this as a powerful sort of symbol of those who were fighting against his fight against the institution of slavery. So when he came that December, the area where we're standing now on Shattuck was packed with people that Kirk Boot and others recruited to come explicitly onto Merrimack and Shattuck and disrupt the talk that Thompson was going to give. And they tried blocking people from getting in. At one point, actually, on one of the days of one of the meetings at the end of November, people got here first who were opposed to Thompson speaking, and they packed the hall. And so fearful that something might happen inside, they actually canceled the meeting till 2 o'clock the next day, so as to sort of calm the waters, if you will. And several of the leading citizens in Lowell, who are again against Thompson, go to the Lowell City Council, the government of the city, and try to get the permit pulled to let Thompson speak. And the city council refuses.
Wow.
They basically say, no, we're not going to do that. And Thompson speaks. Even though the rock flies through the window and almost hits him, he continues with his talk. And then, in the irony of all ironies, rather than sort of pick up and leave, after his talk, he's approached by several women who want help forming a female anti-slavery society in Lowell. And he sticks around an extra day to help them figure out how to organize.
We can't forget the history and the important things that happened on these cobblestone streets. Just across the street, we continue our tour with a stop on the Underground Railroad. Kirk Boot and the Merrimack Manufacturing Corporation made provisions for a house of worship to be established and built in the new mill town of Lowell. The cornerstone was laid in 1824, and St. Anne's would be the first church erected by a manufacturing company instead of a group of worshipers. The exterior was built from stones removed as workers dug out the canals that powered the mills. The first service was officiated by Theodore Edson, an Episcopal deacon.
March 6, 1824, Saturday. Came up to Chelmsford the first time for the purpose of supplying the people in the Merrimack Manufacturing Corporation with preaching and divine service. Rode up with Mr. Boot and was hospitably entertained at his house. Sunday, preached.
Edson lived in the adjacent rectory.
Theodore Edson becomes a minister from the middle of the 1820s for most of the rest of the 19th century, and becomes a really significant character in the life of Lowell in anti-slavery work, but also in public education. He's on the Lowell School Committee for a number of years, and he's just a very active and engaged human being. And the rectory where we're sitting now is one of these really important buildings, well preserved, and really has a story to tell.
So I bet when Kirk Boot said, we need to build this church, he had no idea what kind of person the Reverend was going to be. I wonder if that ruffled some feathers when he realized that this Reverend was on the side of abolition.
I could well imagine that they would be at odds from time to time. Kirk Boot, the overseer of the boot mill, and the person that operated the boarding houses and a lot of other stuff in the city, wanted a church to be built where he could regulate the behavior of the young women that worked for him in his mills. And he would march every Sunday morning those women over to the church, the big beautiful church next door to the rectory. And the back pews of the church are elevated a bit higher than the rest of the pews, so that the supervisors as well as Kirk Boot could stand in the back and count the house to make sure everybody actually marched over from the boarding houses to come to church on Sunday. And one way or the other, Boot, Child, and Edson's paths crossed on numerous occasions around this issue of cotton, slavery, and abolition.
And in this building particularly, they were talking about Underground Railroad movements, and they house people here, right?
So we're fortunate that, amongst other things that Edson did, he kept a diary. And there are volumes and volumes and volumes of his handwritten thoughts and feelings and goings-on in Lowell and such.
One passage describes a freedom seeker named John Taylor, who escaped from Mississippi and makes his way to Lowell on the Underground Railroad.
And he meets up with Edson, and he stays in the rectory for several days with Edson before then he continues further north, up eventually into Canada. St. Anne's as a church is an integrated church, which even some of the anti-slavery churches necessarily weren't. Edson welcomed African and fugitive parishioners, and that the basement of the church still is a space where people would have hidden as fugitives. It really is incredible. You said you get chills. Yeah, when I walk by here, I always do.
So what are we going to see?
What was a hideout where fugitives would have gone if slave catchers showed up and they needed a place to sort of be spirited away so they wouldn't be found out. So you can't really see it now because it's like caved in and whatever, but underneath there was a tunnel that was dug out away from the church basement out toward the river, so that people could, again, should people actually get into the building to be pursuing, people could sort of secret their way out toward the river.
This is a stop on the Underground Railroad, and that is one of the coolest things to me, that we're here and the historical significance of what this space is and what this has meant for freedom seekers.
Several Lowell churches were involved in the anti-slavery conversation. The Second Universalist Church, the Church of the First Unitarian Society, First United Baptist Church, and St. Paul's Methodist Church. Jonathan Levy, minister of the John Street Church, was forceful with his parishioners.
There's a booklet of several of his sermons that's been preserved. And he really links these things together and says, look, if you can't say you're a Christian, you can't say you believe in all of this stuff if you also think it's okay for people to own other people. It's such a sharp inconsistency that I'm calling you, basically he would say to his church, I'm calling your faith into question. Jonathan Levy and Edson, they were very clear on immediate abolition, should just end it. Right? But there were other ministers in Lowell that could be for the ending of the institution, but they were for it ending in its natural death, if you will, that after a date certain, anybody born would be free. But that everybody that was alive that was enslaved would stay enslaved until they were dead. So somebody who was enslaved as a child in 1855, then if they lived for 60 more years, they would have lived into the 20th century as enslaved.
Other people thought that slave owners should be compensated by the government for their loss of human property. And still others considered repatriation to Africa the best way to abolish slavery.
And so we're going to purchase ships. We're going to purchase an area of land on the coast of Africa. And we will essentially ship, literally and figuratively, everybody back. And that was the position that was held by several presidents of the United States, including James Monroe. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named after James Monroe. And so some people actually were repatriated. It was an organization that was called the American Colonization Society. And so it existed for a long time, and it was definitely, I'm putting in quotes, a remedy. But Edson was staunch. Edson was not, I'm not equivocating here. I'm not screwing around with this. This has to end.
The contradictions were rife across all industries and religious beliefs. Lowell textile mill sold much of its rough cotton cloth to southern plantations to be used for clothing for their enslaved workers. Its mill workers and churches saw the contradictions, but were steadfast in their belief in the injustice of slavery. Lowell played an important role in the lead-up to the Civil War and the war itself. Lowell men were willing to die for the cause.
It's also significant to know that when it comes closer to war, and the war actually is going to essentially break out, one of the first military units that gets formed to go south and fight the Confederacy is formed in Lowell. The first casualties of the Civil War are people that are in this regiment from Lowell, and they're buried in front of City Hall.
Stories like this make me so proud to have been born here, because that's the legacy that I think about.
It's a human rights question, it's an equality question, it's a question of humanity and fairness. And Lowell in its history stood on, for me at least, and you I'm sure, the proper side of history, and we should be doing the same thing now.
The steadfast bravery of those in Lowell who defiantly fought with their pens, their voices, and even their lives for freedom for all really did bend the arc of history toward justice.
And I hope that folks will take in this information and Lowell will continue to stand on the right side of history.